sake of the world, burn like a fire in me. Light a flame in my soul for every eye to see. For the sake of the world, burn like a fire in me.
Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are going to be facilitating an off-campus small group through Dayspring's ministry. If you're leading a small group for adults on the week of January the 25th, 2015, then this video is designed to help you get ready to do that. So grab your Going Deeper guide for the week of January 25, and I'm going to be looking at it with you. I'm going to be talking about it. Maybe I'll say some things that will help you as you facilitate your small group this week. So grab something to write with, and you can jot some notes down along the way. Here's what this small group discussion guide is going to be about, and it's a really simple one. What you're trying to do this week is to facilitate a discussion as it relates to the willingness and preparedness that we have to share the gospel. That's what the sermon's all about. It's about us being willing to share the gospel and prepared to share the gospel. Your discussion guide is going to take you deeper into that. And one thing that you may want to remember as a group facilitator this week is that on Wednesday, January the 28th at Dayspring, we're having a training for this purpose. For those who want to be prepared and equipped to share the gospel, we're having an evangelism training event on Wednesday night, January the 28th. So if your group has not met yet, by the time that your group meets, and if that's still ahead of you, then that's something that you can promote in your small group time, because again, we're talking about being willing and prepared, and that will help some to be prepared. But that's what your small group discussion is about this week. And what you're going to do is you're going to look at two different passages in the Bible. From those two passages, you're going to present a principle, and that principle is going to help us learn something about leading people to faith in Christ in our conversations and in our relationships, all right? So let's look at the group guide together. We've got 10 points to look at real briefly. Let's start with number one. Number one is your recap point, where you look at it. This is the way you always start your small group time. You read a passage that I taught from on Sunday, and then that gets the ball rolling as you recollect and recap what you heard on Sunday. And of course, part of that is taking notes while you're listening to the sermon so that you have something to look at and remember. So as the group facilitator, that's what you do in this first point. You say, let's look at Acts chapter 8, 28 and following. Let's read that, and then let's talk about what we heard Sunday and what really stuck with us, all right? So you'll get that going, and then you can move on to discussion point number two. Now, discussion point number two is just a conversation piece. There's no right or wrong answer you're listening for here. Everyone will provide an answer that is right because they're talking about themselves. You're asking, would you say that sharing the gospel comes naturally for you, totally unnatural for you, or somewhere in between? And all you're doing here is getting people to talk about whether or not sharing the gospel is something that they like to do or can do or will do or have never done. You're making conversation here. Probably you're going to discover that for a lot of people it's an uncomfortable thing, maybe something that they don't participate in regularly or maybe even never. So you're just talking about that, how comfortable are we and how natural is sharing the gospel. Now from there, you're going to move into those two different Bible passages. Look at discussion point number three. It says, most people come to faith through the influence of a friend. This is called relational evangelism. And I want you to understand something about that statement right there. It may seem that that's just sort of an assumed statement that's just kind of put on a piece of paper. But I do want you to know that that statement, that most people nowadays who come to faith in Christ come as the result of what's called relational evangelism. That statement is actually born out of research, okay? So that's not just a statement that's put there because it's the assumption of who wrote this handout. That's there because it's based on research. We just don't have time on this short handout to show where all the research and data comes from. But, there are two forms of evangelism, basically. You have what's called mass evangelism. That's sort of like a revival meeting, or where someone like an evangelist may present the gospel message to a large crowd, kind of Billy Graham style, and a lot of people in mass would respond. That's mass evangelism. The other is relational evangelism or relationship evangelism. That's more person to person, friend to friend. All the data indicates that mass evangelism is kind of on the decline, but that relational evangelism is on the up and up. So that statement, most people come to faith through the influence of a friend, relational evangelism, Since that's the case, that's what this handout's going to talk about, relational evangelism and how we can be more equipped and better at it, all right? But I did want you to know that that's born out of research. James Emery White, for example, who's a prominent Christian writer and sort of researcher and pastor, James Emery White states it this way. He says, it's rare for people to become engaged, much less married on the first date, and accepting Christ is no different. He says, people don't make big decisions real quick, like engagement, marriage, that sort of things. Accepting Christ is no different. People are going to explore that and investigate that and want to hear that. And it seems that people now want to hear that from someone they know, not just some stranger. In the past, apparently that didn't seem to be such a big deal, but now it does seem to be. So, since relational evangelism is sort of the thing now, we need to be equipped for that and prepared for that and willing to engage in that. Now, we're getting ready to do that. Look at discussion point number 4. It says, read Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. Now, that is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the Good Samaritan isn't necessarily an evangelism passage, but it reminds us of one of the principles that we want to talk about. Now, look at discussion point number 5. This is going to get us there. It says, the Good Samaritan's act of kindness cost him something. Scan back over this parable and talk about what all he invested. Now, as you and your group scan back over that, maybe give them a chance to scan over it, and then you all together start talking out loud what the Good Samaritan invested. Now, there's going to be an obvious investment there that he made of his money. You're going to see that. And by the way, some things that will just be helpful to you as a facilitator, when it says that he used up oil and wine to patch up basically the guy's wounds, point that out. Those were not cheap things to come by for a guy like the Samaritan. So there's an investment there. The oil and the wine, that was costly. Exactly how costly, I couldn't tell you. I would maybe have to do some research on that. But it was costly. We do know that. It says that he left behind some money with an innkeeper to take care of this guy who had been hurt. That was, a couple of coins that he left behind was approximately 1/3 of a week's wage for him. So that's a pretty stiff investment. I mean, you think about in your own life, in your own family's life, how much money does your family make in a week? Well, imagine chopping off 1/3 of that and investing it into a stranger. So he made a pretty big investment into this guy who had been hurt and on the side of the road. But here's what I want you to do as the group facilitator. Help everyone see the other kind of investments that he made, not just the money one. The money one's going to stand out and everybody's probably going to pick up on that. But think about these other investments that was made. Think about his time. I mean, imagine taking the time to see someone who's wounded on the side of the road, to patch them up, to bind up their wounds a little bit, to carry them into the city, to get them a hotel, to search all of that out, to make the conversations, to come back in a month and check up on them. This guy made a pretty significant time investment, an energy investment. If you're like me, I don't like to get sweaty when I'm on the way somewhere. This guy probably got pretty sweaty. There's an energy investment that he made. A pride investment. Don't let this pass by that this was a Jew and a Samaritan. And we've talked about this in church sometimes. For a Jew and a Samaritan to interact was a big, big deal. For this Samaritan to really extend himself toward a Jewish man and to be seen in public with him and to take him to a hotel and all of this, he had to swallow some pride there. How about this? The investment of just risk. I mean, obviously this path that this guy took, who was robbed and beaten, this was a dangerous road. To get involved with someone who's been beat up, you're putting yourself at risk because what if the perpetrator is still close by? So, I mean, there are all kinds of investments that this Samaritan man made in this account. And the reason that you're bringing all of this up is because it leads us to a principle that matters as it relates to relational evangelism. And this is found in discussion point number 6. Here it is. It says, consider this general principle. Now, this is just a general principle, not an evangelism principle. This is a general principle. That the greater the investment, the greater the return. Now, we know that principle, right? From money stuff and investing and all of that. The greater the investment, the greater the return. Now, let's connect the dots here. Look at it. It says, talk about this principle relative to leading someone to Christ. In what ways does it apply? So think about this. In your life, let's say you take a friend that you know. What is something that could result in their life that would make you the happiest? What is the best return, relational return, that you could ever witness in the life of someone, in particular, someone who doesn't believe? What's the greatest return you could ever see in their life? Obviously, the greatest thing that you could ever witness in their life that would be the best thing ever would be to see them receive Christ, right? I mean, that's what we would want to see in their life, for them to accept Christ and receive Him. We would say that is the greatest relational investment I've ever invested because of the return that came out of it. Here's the principle. If a principle is true that the greater the investment, the greater the return, then what this means is this, that if we want to see that return in people's lives, if we want to see that return of them believing and receiving Christ, the probability is we're going to have to make a pretty significant investment into their life. The same kind of investments that we saw the Good Samaritan make. So maybe that's something you can bring up. You can say, if that principle is true, that the greater the investment, the greater the return, and if we want to see that great return of people receiving Christ, then maybe we're going to have to make the same kinds of investments that the Samaritan made. Time, energy, money, risk, pride. Talk about those things and talk about how those are the kind of investments that we're probably going to have to make if we want to see what we would consider to be the greatest return that we could ever see in the life of another human. So there's one principle that we really need to grab hold of as it relates to leading people to Christ. It's going to cost us something. All kinds of things it may cost us. All right? Now that brings us to the second principle. This one's going to be born out of another passage. Discussion point number 7. You're going to read 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. Now this is a letter written by the Apostle Paul to the Christians in a city called Thessalonica. So he's writing them a letter. Now after you read that portion of the letter, look at discussion point number 8. It says, Paul and his fellow missionaries didn't just pass through this city. They set up shop and they lived there. So here's another principle. Look at this one. Relationship evangelism is usually a long, long process. Paul didn't just swing into Thessalonica and share the gospel and move on. He set up shop there. He had to spend a great deal of time there. And we see this all throughout his missionary journeys, especially a place like Ephesus. I mean, he would spend years there to establish his work. So talk about why this is probably the case. Talk about why relational evangelism is probably something that takes a long, long time. Why is that the case? I mean, think about it. Why is that the case? Think about it from your end. If someone was trying to convince you of a life-altering decision, something that would change the very fabric of who you are and how you live and what you believe, why would it take a long time for them to persuade you and to win you over? Just think about that. The reality is part of the convincing process. When someone's trying to convince you of something, part of the convincing process is you have to be convinced that they are authentic. If it's someone trying to convince you of some sort of a dietary thing, you need to be convinced that it's worked in their life. The gospel's no different. When we're trying to convince people that the gospel works, that it's worth receiving and believing, they have to be convinced that it has worked in us and through us. So this is why it takes a long, long time. People have to be convinced that it affects my fathering and my husbandry, and it affects all of those things from me if they're going to receive it from me. This is why at Dayspring we talk about that our very mission is to make sure that people hear and see the gospel. They have to hear it come out of my mouths, but they have to be convinced that it works in my life. So look at these two principles again. The greater the investment, the greater the return, which means we're going to have to invest heavily into the lives of people if we're going to see that return of receiving Christ, and that we're going to have to probably do this for a long, long time. Those are two principles that we really need to know and understand. It will help us stay the course. It'll help us not become so discouraged along the way. Two things that we really need to latch on to. Now look at discussion point number 9, and I hope that you don't run out of time to do this. If you do, make time for it. Discussion point number 9, it says, share the first name of one person that you really want to lead to Christ, or someone you really need to lead to Christ. Share that first name with each other. Write these names down so that you can all pray for each other. And what I would hope that this would be is not just a one-time thing for your group. Try and make this, as you facilitate this group time, try and make this an ongoing thing. That, let's say if you have 8 people in your small group, you walk away with a list of 7 to 8 names that are now written down and in front of you that you are praying for on a weekly, if not a daily basis, that you are praying that your friends would have the privilege of leading those people to Christ, all right? And this is something that you can begin this week, that can be an ongoing thing. And by the way, I want you to think about this. Imagine the degree of celebration that would erupt in your group one day if this is something y'all been praying for week after week after week, and then one week somebody says, you're not going to believe what happened this week, and they tell you that they were able to lead one of these people to Christ. Imagine the celebration that would break out in your group. That'd be pretty cool, wouldn't it? So get that and make that a part of your ongoing experience as a group. And the discussion point number 10 just leads you to this week's memory verse. And look at it with me. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. It says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. And of course, that verse presupposes that we are living the kind of lives that people would want to ask us a question about the hope that we have. And when they do ask, we're prepared to share that answer with them. All right? So that's what your group guide's all about this week. It's about us being willing and prepared to share the gospel. I hope that as a result of your time together this week, I hope that the result of your group time is twofold. That number one, you and your group members become more and more willing and prepared to share the gospel. And number two, I pray that somebody is written down on a list that you guys start praying for who eventually believes. Hey, thanks for tuning in and listening. Have a great group time this week, and we'll see you Wednesday or Sunday.